Our second speaker this afternoon is Professor Wolfgang Heuer, who is at the Free University. He is the at the Otto Struve Institute for Political Science at Free University of Berlin. He's the managing editor of the journal HannahArendt.net. And he's done a tremendous amount of work on Hannah Arendt in several publications. The one that to my mind has been such a tremendous contribution is the Hannah Arendt Handbook, which I think is about 700 pages at least.
Yeah, 500.
Yeah. It's an amazing piece of work, and I think an invaluable resource for those working on Hannah Arendt. I'd have to say personally, so I feel like I'm just saying what's already in the program notes. I will say, in addition, something you might not know is I have a wonderful memory of Wolfgang. There was a freakish snowstorm 2 years ago at Bard College in late October, where literally the lights failed and we found ourselves huddled together in a van being taken back to the Holiday Inn. And you were such good cheer throughout that. So in any case, moving right along, Professor Heuer's talk this afternoon to us is, and I think this is a great lecture to follow Professor Harrison's. The title is "Who is Capable of Performing Action? Some Thoughts on the Importance of Responsibility." So again, I think this is going to continue the conversation we're having. And so Wolfgang, as they say in Germany, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. These are very, very kind words of introduction. And I'm very glad to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation of the organizers and all the discussions here, which are very inspiring. And who is capable of performing action? So this is a question which came up after reading again and again Hannah Arendt talking about the miracle that saves the world from its normal, natural ruin. And then the action, and there's a lot of action and so on. And then she makes a distinction between the who is acting from the what of the actor, or the who of the actor and the what of the actor. And we all know when we are here in the conference on a party or so on, then we ask, who are you? And the answer is, I'm American, working in Los Angeles and teaching something or working or fabricating something and going to a conference here. And this is in reality the what of someone is doing and not the who. And Hannah Arendt says the who is showing itself. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper, and so it's a little bit more interpretation of Hannah Arendt's more hidden aspects of this question. Who is capable of performing action, and a little bit going on with the inspiration. And these are reflections with a lot of open questions. I will start with the non-action and the dilemma of action in the contemporary world. Hannah Arendt's supposition is intriguing, namely that often when all political action has died away, as during the totalitarian domination of Eastern Europe, all of a sudden, people start to act and initiate a new beginning. It happened in Hungary in 1956, when the miracle of unexpected action led to a whole revolution. Though the revolution was crushed, this event proved that action and a new beginning were possible even under extreme difficult conditions. This experience encouraged the Prague Spring of 1968 and finally the peaceful revolution in Eastern Europe in 1989. All these new beginnings were inspired by the knowledge that beyond the totality of the factual world of the so-called real existing socialism, there was another world which was not identical to real existing capitalism. That new world consisted of an open orientation towards the future, and in the free decisions of its actors, but it also consisted in the conservation and recovery of the so-called suppressed and the replaced. In a theoretical essay on the Hungarian Revolution, Hannah Arendt describes, with the help of an example she found in a French newspaper, what the persistence of the suppressed and the possibility of an alternative meant. This example deals with the Russian writer Boris Pasternak, who was not killed under Stalin or forced into exile, but nonetheless, as a form of protest, remained silent for decades. In 1946, he was invited to give a lecture in Moscow, attended, as the journal wrote, by a huge crowd, although his name, after all the years of silence, was only known as a translator of Shakespeare and Goethe into Russian. He read some of his poems, and as it happened, while reading an old poem, the sheet of paper slipped out of his hand, like this. Arendt then continues, citing from the text of the newspaper. In that moment, it was written in the newspaper, a voice in the room continued to recite the poem by heart. From several corners of the room, other voices were heard, and the recitation of the interrupted text ended in a chorus. The suppressed and replaced had remained present during the whole time. Now, not only totalitarianism presents a challenge for the question as to whether or not independent thinking and action is possible, but our own time as well. Since the end of the bipolar world and the Cold War, a vast transformation is circling the two poles, neoliberalism on the one hand and terrorism on the other. Neoliberalism consisting of the withdrawal of the state, increased privatization of public services, increased public debt, and the uncontrolled activities of banks and financial institutions. On the one side, terrorism as a synonym for ethnic wars declared by terrorist groups against whole populations or states, to which those states respond and retaliate through asymmetric warfare and secret surveillance programs undertaken by intelligence agencies and business groups. We are facing a dilemma, because the apparent conclusion reads, there is no alternative either in the conduct of finance as it pertains to crisis management of the global economy or of the conduct of the state regarding questions of national security. At the same time, the criteria by which we judge with which arguments and which actions are justified gets lost. The Indian writer Salman Rushdie asks who in our contemporary world can be regarded as a courageous politician. Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro as opponents of imperialism, or Nicolas Sarkozy, who intervened militarily in Libya in order to support the insurgents against Gaddafi, the governor of the province of Punjab in Pakistan, who defended a Christian woman sentenced to death because of blasphemy, or the governor's bodyguard, who killed him and was hailed in court and showered with leaves of roses by the public. Any action in the tradition of Hungary in 1956 or Prague 68 seems to be not only risky, but also clearly dangerous because of the possibility of failure. Whistleblowers in the United States defending freedom of information, or authors of Twitters in the Arab world defending freedom of speech and religion are persecuted worldwide. The general device is as follows: do not risk anything, do not endanger yourself, therefore do not act. Moreover, it seems as if in a constitutional state with more or less well-organized institutions, everything should work on its own. The constitution and democratic institutions regulating general issues and caring as much as possible for the enforcement of the laws that ensure justice. During the European crisis, most governing politicians argue, using a slogan of Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative, so opposing views are silenced and the crisis continues. In addition, there is a common attitude among politicians that they do not need to study politics and the experience of those who have acted in the past. Quite different from Machiavelli, for example, who compared his own experiences with those compiled by the classical historian Livius in Roman times to discover similarities and to draw lessons from them. In a similar way, there is a predominant opinion among academics and the public that theories are created at desks nearly out of nothing, that they are developed by hard, logical work by specialists and groups of investigators at university and think tanks. But the life and work of Hannah Arendt proves the contrary. Her own work was based on her experience as a Jew, refugee, and political thinker and actor. She also took into consideration the experiences of others as lived according to the circumstances of their own times. So, for example, she started shortly before her emigration to study the problems of assimilation with the example of the Jewess Rahel Varnhagen in the form of a history, which, as Arendt wrote, Varnhagen could have told herself, the description following the reflections of Rahel with the best possible accuracy. And that made any further interpretation for Arendt unnecessary. In her book about totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt describes the encounter of European colonialists with the inhabitants of Africa with the help of Joseph Conrad's novel In the Heart of Darkness to trace the profound dismay and racism of the Europeans. And also the story about Pasternak's lecture plays a decisive role for Arendt in analyzing political phenomena. In her seminar with the title Political Experiences in the 20th Century, Arendt used literary and autobiographical documents exclusively, quite unusual in a seminar on political sciences, to make accessible real historical events as a mechanism for enlarging the mentality of the students and to help them to acquire the facility of judgment. So, she does not, for example, discuss with the students the importance of the enlarged mentality in Immanuel Kant. Rather, she simply exercises it. Theory for Arendt meant understanding, not science. In her note for the seminar History of Political Theory, given at the University of California at Berkeley in 1955, she distinguished between authors and commentators. Concerning the classics of modern political thought, Hobbes, Locke, and Montesquieu, Arendt was not interested in them as theorists, but instead as thinkers. Experiences, according to Arendt, precede thoughts and theories, and not vice versa. She was interested in the quality of those experiences and how that was reflected in their writings. In that respect, she was quite skeptical regarding the field of political theory. Political theory, according to Arendt, moves between the experiences in history and the concepts of philosophy and becomes, as she called it, a kind of meeting ground for disappointed philosophers or statesmen. Authors, in the literal sense, are those, according to Arendt, who enrich the world with their works, because they move in the same world as we do, namely the real world, while commentators move in the world of books. She wrote in this unpublished papers of her seminar, the authors are auctores, that is, they augment the world. We move in a world which is augmented by the authors. We cannot do without them, because they behave in an altogether different way from the commentators. The world in which the commentator moves is a world of books. This difference becomes visible in a person like Machiavelli. Machiavelli was interested in Italy, not in political theory, not even his own. Only the commentator is interested in political theory per se, wrote Arendt. While the author as political writer also loves the world, the commentator only loves political theory. That is not to say we also do not need the latter. Rather, according to Arendt, we need to keep in mind that when we move in the world with a commentator, strictly speaking, it is not the author's world we inhabit, whereas when we read the author directly, we move in the same world as our own, but approached from a different corner. This is the last citation from Arendt. Returning to our original question, namely living as we do in a world that is allegedly without any alternatives. While there's always a possibility of action creating something new and unexpected, Such action requires actors. So if we cannot turn to the commentators and the futurologists, but instead must turn to the autores and the experiences, then we are confronted with the question, who exactly are these actors? And where are they supposed to come from? And here we find in Hannah Arendt's work descriptions of these actors who are distinctive personalities like the authors, but are not individuals in the sense of how that term has come to be used. Because an individual literally means the smallest indivisible unit, while a personality is an actor playing this role in a world of interpersonal events. In what follows, I would like to consider two aspects of the actor in more detail. What is the difference between a person and an individual? And second, what does it mean to adopt a position and to be a judge? The special marks of a person is their visibility and distinctiveness. They do not get lost in the general mass. They become visible because of their twofold characteristics, which are interpersonal as well as independent. A person acts together with others, but also in relationship to others. They act together, but also alone. In her text, Some Questions of Moral Philosophy, Hannah Arendt describes being a person as a precondition for being able to resist evil. Being a person, writes Arendt in this text, distinguished from being merely human. And if we follow her thesis of the inner dialogue as a dialogue between a thinking I and a judging me, then, I cite Hannah Arendt of this text, we may say that in this process of thought, in which I actualize a specifically human difference of speech, I explicitly constitute myself as a person, and I shall remain one to the extent that I am capable of such constitution ever again and anew. If this is what we commonly call personality, and it has nothing to do, writes Arendt, with gifts and intelligence, it is a simple, almost automatic result of thoughtfulness. To put it another way, in granting pardon, it is the person and not the crime that is forgiven. In rootless evil, there is no person left whom one could ever forgive. Now, this inner dialogue does not need to be about moral imperatives or even depend on them, but rather only on the fact that, as Arendt wrote in this text, a mere human being leads an inner dialogue in order to be in accordance with themselves. And the very existence of that dialogue, irrespective of the subject, already has a moral dimension. Arendt wrote, to speak about a moral personality is almost a redundancy. And here Arendt adds a highly interesting aspect. The consequences of not thinking or engaging in this inner dialogue means not only the loss of morality and the possible transgression of the border between civilization and barbarity, but also the loss of artistic quality. Sometimes we are talking about aesthetics today and the artists. And it's interesting that she adds this in this text on evil. She writes, I cite, insofar as thinking is an activity, it can be translated into products, into such things as poems or music or painting. All things of this kind are actually thought things, just as furniture and the objects of our daily use are rightly called use things. Hannah Arendt then goes on to observe, when commentating on mass murderers, that, I cite, the point about these highly cultivated murderers is that there has been not a single one of them who wrote a poem worth remembering, or a piece of music worth listening to, or painting a picture that anybody would care, or painted a picture that anybody would care to hang on his walls. More than thoughtfulness is needed to write a good poem or piece of music or to paint a picture. You need special gifts. But not gifts will withstand the loss of integrity, which you lose when you lost this most common capacity for thought and remembrance. This definition of personality refers to all human beings in the same way, to workers, academics, and politicians. That moral and artistic quality rests in equal measure on independent thinking and on independent judgment is already visible in our everyday use of language whenever we speak of a beautiful or ugly gesture or figure of speech, or of the inner beauty which a person possessing integrity shows by that integrity. These examples are, according to Kant, expressions of the harmony of the different powers of cognition, both in regards to their inner proportions and in respect of the free coexistence of these powers and their mutual influence on one another. This is one aspect which goes a little bit deeper to this aspect of aesthetics and politics in Hannah Arendt, which she doesn't elaborate here. But we can find something in Kant. It is a harmony which occurs between form and content, as well as between an enlarged mentality and reason, differs from purely rational judgment. Before Arendt studied Kant's theory of aesthetic judgment, she referred to the understanding heart of King Solomon in the Bible, which is difficult to define. It comprises equally heart and mind. Arendt wrote, "Only an understanding heart, and not mere reflection or mere feeling, makes it bearable for us to live with other people, strangers forever, in the same world, and makes it possible for them to bear with us." The fact that this proximity between ethics and aesthetics and the interplay between heart and mind can be defined only approximately is a prize for freedom and for the possibilities of a person to act. When we follow Arendt in her train of thought, we find a whole tradition of thinking which is worthwhile to take into consideration. It goes back to the discussions in the 18th century about taste as a power of cognition in a secular society increasingly oriented towards freedom. There we find, for example, the following citation of Melchior Grimm, a more or less forgotten German illustrator, essayist and diplomat. He wrote, "The condition of a pronounced and perfect taste is to have a sharp intellect, a sensitive soul, and a righteous heart." Here taste does not only mean the aesthetic judgment, but also the moral judgment. In Grimm's trilogy, all these elements are indispensable in their mutual conditionality. Reason can become inhuman without soul and heart. The sensitive soul apolitical due to an unchecked compassion. The righteous heart confused without reason. However, with Kant, the era of investigations into the conditions for an independent judgment ended. During the 19th and 20th century, the Kantian capacity to judge was replaced by logic, ideologies, and systems. But there are exceptions. Harking back to Arendt's discovery of a forgotten Enlightenment tradition is the writer and journalist George Orwell. His works are marked by a hypothesis, namely that the decency inherent in the everyday life of normal people can resist the general loss of orientation in an age of ideology. He wrote, "It looks like a platitude. If men would behave decent, the world would be decent." He tried to interpret what he called the common decency as a compass not only of single persons but also of the social and political life of citizens. According to Orwell, this common decency rests on general, practical, everyday moral norms and habits. Common decency differs from explicit and rigid moral prescriptions of the good human being by its openness and flexibility. For Orwell, it was not human dignity in an abstract way that had to be protected, but the behavior to which a society commits itself that was in need of defending. The decent life affords social regulations that consist of respect for others, the absence of domination or humiliation, and social, economic, and cultural equality. The highest income should not be 10 times higher than the lowest. All laws should respect or support a decent life and include all citizens in the, how he called it, pouvoir constituant des vies ordinaires. Orwell was against the socialism of his time as an oligarchy collectivism which attracted only the socially marginalized and intellectuals. In our country, he wrote, the liberals fear freedom and the intellectuals are ready for any sort of ignominy against thinking. That means, he wrote, the direct conscious attack on intellectual decency comes from the intellectuals themselves. This aspect of decency refers to what for Arendt is the basis of all political action and independent judgment, the effort to recover in a political community the right middle ground and human scale that marks the place where civilization ends. Like Hannah Arendt and George Orwell, Albert Camus stressed the importance of moderation, but instead observed excess among Marxist intellectuals after World War II in his most provocative book, The Rebel. Revolutionary errors, he declared, disregarded natural limits and in so doing betrayed human inviolability. The experience of modern revolutions show, as he wrote, that revolutions, when they have no limits other than historical effectiveness, means endless slavery. For Camus, it is the task of revolt to redefine the place of the right middle and human scale in a permanent critical confrontation with present conditions. Herein lays the actuality of these three authors, Arendt, Orwell, and Camus. Writing about totalitarianism, they described the conditions of a decent society, which today is menaced not by revolts or mass protests, but quite the contrary, by the destruction of politics and the common good by neoliberalism. What does it mean, the second point? What does it mean to adopt a political act and to adopt a position and to judge? For Hannah Arendt, it means three things. Firstly, the necessity of what she called being in the world. Secondly, to define freedom as freedom for, as intersubjective, common freedom, inseparably connected to responsibility. Thirdly, the formation of a community of judgment, which means the selection of those with whom we want to act and judge and who also serve as models. On the first point, to be in the world means a clear change of perspective in the history of thinking in the modern age. Arendt no longer defines the world from the perspective of modern subjectivism, from an individual facing the masses, but from the in-between of people acting together. It is a standpoint of those who act or of spectators who are interested in judging action. Those who are not interested in the common world exclude themselves from this in-between. From the perspective of this common world, Arendt defines what unites people. It is not reason, which we are proud of because it distinguishes us from animals. This is a little bit like Portman. There's also a difference in Arendt, but rather what she called an enlarged mentality. So we always learned at school what is the difference between humankind and animals, so we are very reasonable. Oh, wonderful. She says, no, this is not the difference. It is the enlarged mentality. In a Denktagebuch, thinking diary, she wrote, because of the fact that not self-bound reason, but only an enlarged mentality makes it possible to think in the place of another, it is not reason but the enlarged mentality which forms the link between human beings. Against this sense of self, fueled by reason, by the I think, one finds a sense for the world, fueled by the others as common sense, passive, and the enlarged mentality, active. This is the quote of Arendt. From this interpersonal perspective follows the second aspect, that freedom is to be understood as freedom for, as intersubjective common freedom, which is inseparably bound to the responsibility for everything that happens in the political community. This responsibility does not deal with moral or juridical guilt for one's own actions, but instead is the responsibility of someone who is a responder, who understands that the action of all decide whether or not we live in a decent society. In her essay Collective Responsibility, Arendt explained, I cite, the vicarious responsibility for things we have not done, this taking upon ourselves the consequences for things we are entirely innocent of, is the price we pay for the fact that we live our lives not by ourselves, but among our fellow men. And that the faculty of action, which after all is the political faculty par excellence, can be actualized only in one of the many and manifold forms of human community. This standpoint, from the perspective of interpersonal relations within a political community, means that the faculty of judgment is intersubjective, a common judgment. Here too we encounter again the heritage of the 18th century Enlightenment, where Arendt in her essay The Crisis in Culture argues that taste possesses an organizational force of peculiar strength. I cite, "We all know very well how quickly people recognize each other and how unequivocally they can feel that they belong to each other when they discover a kinship in questions of what pleases and displeases. From the viewpoint of this experience, it is as though taste decides not only how the world is to look, but also who belongs together in it." This remark has been rejected by readers time and again as the expression of an elitist, aristocratic, and therefore undemocratic attitude. However, this criticism overlooks the fact that Arendt was concerned not only with common judgment, but also with quality consciousness, the sense that, I cite, "the truly beautiful is easily recognized." It is not decisive that we judge together, but how we judge. It is all about quality and also about a consciousness of quality through which the humanity of a society increases. Transferred to politics, it means to be able to identify and judge the quality of political wisdom, and thus to contribute and to improve that political wisdom. It is also evident that in Arendt, ethics and aesthetics are closely tied together. I cite from a text about Crisis in Culture. "This humanism has the task of arbitrating and mediating between the purely political and the purely fabricating activities which share the public space. Therefore, personalities possessing the capacities for action and judgment have a big responsibility for the humanization of their societies. Therefore, it is not by chance that Arendt, in her portraits of writers, politicians, and scientists, which she wrote on various occasions and published in her book Men in Dark Times, always came to speak about their personal qualities. For example, Lessing's critical faculty fascinated her. She wrote, "Criticism, in Lessing's sense, is always taking sides for the world's sake, understanding and judging everything in terms of its position in the world at any given time. Such a mentality can never give rise to a definite worldview which, once adopted, is immune to further experiences in the world, because it has hitched itself firmly to one possible perspective." Arendt praised Rosa Luxemburg's cultural background of an assimilated Jewish life in Poland, characterized by excellent literary taste, independent moral concepts, and the absence of social prejudices. And in an obituary for her friend Waldemar Gurian, Dean of the American University at Notre Dame, she praised his virtue in a very personal political tone, which is completely unusual in a professional journal like the Review of Politics. In that obituary, Arendt described his personal qualities, which takes the place of political virtues. Among them, the capacity for friendship, not private but public friendship, based on a common responsibility for our destiny. "He came as a stranger," she wrote, "but he had achieved what we all must. He had established his home in this world, and he had made himself at home on the earth through friendship." She praised that, I cite, "his faithfulness to his friends, to everybody he had ever known, to everything he had ever liked, became so much the dominant note on which his life was tuned that one is tempted to say that the crime most alien to him is a crime of oblivion, perhaps one of the cardinal crimes in human relationships." She praised his humanity, which meant more than mere friendliness and gentleness, and which makes us realize the error that, as she wrote, "people daily and gladly identify themselves wholly with what they do, proud of their intelligence or work or genius, and it is true that remarkable results can be the outcome of such identification. But true greatness of genius appears only when we sense behind tangible and comprehensible product of being that remains greater and more mysterious, because work itself points to a person behind it, whose existence can be neither exhausted nor fully revealed by whatever he may he may have the power to do. And finally, she praised his independent judgment, an unerring sense, she wrote, for quality and relevance. In the not frequent cases where men have possessed it and have chosen not to exchange it for more easily recognizable and acceptable values, it infallibly has led them far beyond conventions and established standards of society, and carried them directly into the dangers of a life that is no longer protected by the walls of objects and the supports of objective evaluations. Therefore, Gurian was simultaneously a nonconformist and a realist. Arendt wrote his whole spiritual existence was built on the decision never to conform and never to escape, which is only another way of saying that it was built on courage. He was delighted when he could break down these barriers of so-called civilized society, because he saw in them barriers between human souls. Who would not like to live together with these people in our world? Thank you very much.